The first thing Grace Bennett noticed was not the shattered water glass or the billionaire standing helplessly beside the table. It was the little girl hiding underneath it with both hands pressed over her ears. Around them, the Friday dinner rush continued inside Harrison Street Grill, but the corner booth had become strangely still. 3 business guests stared at their plates. A manager hovered several feet away. Nathan Cole stood beside his 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, holding the phone he had been checking throughout dinner. "Sophie, please come out," he said, keeping his voice controlled. No response. "We can go home if that is what you want." Sophie pulled her knees closer to her chest. Grace had been carrying a tray toward another table when she stopped. She knew Nathan by reputation. Most people in Chicago did. Cole Urban Development had its name attached to buildings across the city, and Nathan's face appeared often enough in business magazines that Grace recognized him immediately. None of that mattered to the child under the table. "Mr. Cole," the restaurant manager whispered, "we can clear this section." Nathan looked embarrassed by the suggestion. "Just give us a minute." Grace set down her tray at the service station. "Grace," her manager warned quietly. "I know." She approached without rushing. Nathan glanced at her name tag. "Could we have some privacy?" "Of course," Grace said. Then she looked at Sophie instead of him. She did not crouch beside the girl or reach underneath the table. She simply moved to an empty chair about 6 feet away and sat down. Nathan frowned. "What are you doing?" "Waiting." "For what?" Grace ignored the question. Sophie's eyes appeared briefly above her knees. Grace noticed the crowded room, clinking silverware, overlapping conversations, and bright pendant lights above the booth. She lowered her voice. "Sophie, would you like everyone to stop looking at you?" The girl stared at her. Then, almost invisibly, she nodded. Nathan went completely still. It was the first response Sophie had given anyone in nearly an hour. Grace stood and turned toward the adults. "Could everybody give her some room, please?" There was no authority in her voice, only certainty. The manager guided the nearby staff away. Nathan's guests moved toward the bar. Nathan remained beside the booth until Grace looked at him. "You too." His eyebrows rose. "I am her father." "I know. Just take 2 steps back." For a man accustomed to having entire rooms respond when he spoke, Nathan looked remarkably uncertain. Still, he stepped away. Grace placed an unopened bottle of water on the floor where Sophie could see it. "You do not have to come out yet," she said. "Nobody is going to make you talk. When you are ready, you can choose whether you want to sit here or go somewhere quieter." Several seconds passed. Then Sophie reached for the bottle. Grace did not smile or praise her. She waited. A minute later, Sophie slowly emerged and climbed into the booth. Nathan immediately moved forward, but Grace raised one hand gently. He stopped. "Quiet place," Sophie whispered. Nathan's expression changed. Relief came first, followed by something Grace could not name. "We can leave," he said. Sophie shook her head. "Not home." Grace pointed toward a small, unused dining room beyond the main floor. "There is a room back there. No music. Fewer people." Sophie looked at her father. Nathan nodded. "Whatever you want." Grace led them there and brought Sophie grilled cheese, apple slices, and water because those were the only things she requested. 20 minutes later, Sophie was eating while Nathan sat across from her with his phone face down on the table. Grace returned to her regular section and finished her shift. She assumed that would be the end of it. Near 11, after the last customers had left and Grace was counting her tips beside the register, she heard footsteps behind her. Nathan stood near the entrance alone. His expensive jacket was folded over one arm, and the confidence he had carried into dinner was gone. "My daughter has had teachers, counselors, caregivers, and specialists trying to reach her for months," he said. "Tonight, she listened to you." Grace closed the cash envelope. "She did not listen to me." Nathan studied her. "Then what happened?" Grace looked toward the empty booth where Sophie had hidden. "Earlier, someone finally listened to her." Nathan remained near the entrance while Grace finished counting her tips, as if he were waiting for an explanation complicated enough to justify what he had witnessed. Grace slipped the cash into her envelope and looked at him. "Your daughter was overwhelmed," she said. "That is all." Nathan frowned. "That is not all. Sophie barely speaks to unfamiliar people when she gets like that. I did not ask her to speak. You got her out from under a table. She got herself out." The distinction seemed to irritate him. Grace had met men like Nathan before, though none owned half a skyline. They believed every problem had a solution if the right person could be hired to provide it. "What did you notice?" he asked. Grace glanced toward the darkened dining room. She covered her ears before she hid. Everyone kept asking questions. People were watching her. Every adult was deciding what she needed without giving her one decision of her own. Nathan lowered his eyes briefly. "She has been difficult since her mother died." Grace's expression softened, but she did not let the word pass. "How long ago?" 14 months. "Then maybe difficult is not the right word." Nathan looked at her. "You do not know my daughter." "No, I do not. That is why I am not going to tell you what is wrong with her." For several seconds, only the kitchen staff could be heard cleaning behind the swinging doors. Nathan placed his jacket over the back of a chair. "We have tried everything. Tutors, caregivers, a child therapist for a while. Her school calls me at least twice a month. She stopped going to birthday parties. Sometimes she will not eat dinner unless it is alone in her room." "That sounds hard." "It is. For her too." Nathan's face tightened, not with anger, but recognition. Grace picked up her purse from beneath the counter. "Mr. Cole, there is nothing wrong with your daughter that needs fixing like a broken appliance. Maybe she needs more time. Maybe she needs consistency. Maybe she needs someone qualified to help her with grief. But tonight she mostly needed fewer people telling her what to do." Nathan was silent long enough that Grace wondered whether she had crossed a line. Then he asked, "Are you trained in this?" "Not exactly." "What does that mean?" "I studied early childhood education for 2 years." "Why did you stop?" Grace adjusted the strap of her purse. "That is a personal question." "You are right. I apologize." The immediate apology surprised her. Nathan reached into his jacket and removed a business card. "I would like to pay you for your time." Grace stared at the card without taking it. "For what?" "Meeting Sophie again. Helping me understand what you did tonight. I served your table. You already tipped me. This would be different." "That is the problem." Nathan seemed genuinely confused. Grace sighed. "Your daughter trusted me for 5 minutes because I was not trying to get something from her. If you turn that into a job before she even knows me, then I become another adult arriving with an assignment. I am trying to help her." "Then start with what she asked for." Nathan looked back toward the dining room. A quiet place, and fewer people staring at her. A faint smile touched his face. "You remember everything she said. That is part of waiting tables. I suspect you are better at your job than that explanation suggests." Grace finally took his card, mostly because leaving him standing there holding it felt unnecessarily dramatic. "I am not promising anything." "Understood. And do not send an assistant here tomorrow with some ridiculous offer." Nathan almost smiled. "How ridiculous?" Grace gave him a look. "Good night, Mr. Cole." She walked toward the employee exit before he could answer. Outside, the Chicago air had turned cold, and Grace pulled her coat tighter as she headed toward the train. Behind her, Nathan remained inside the restaurant with an unfamiliar thought following him home. Perhaps Sophie had never needed another person capable of managing her. Perhaps she needed a father willing to stop managing everything else long enough to hear her. Grace reached her apartment shortly after midnight and found the kitchen lights still on. Her mother, Linda, sat at the small table with a mug of tea and the crossword puzzle she insisted helped her sleep. "Long shift?" Linda asked. "Strange shift." Grace placed Nathan's business card beside a stack of unopened mail and started removing her coat. Linda noticed the embossed lettering immediately. "That looks expensive. Apparently even business cards can have a tax bracket." Linda laughed, but Grace turned the card face down. Their apartment was modest, 2 bedrooms above a neighborhood pharmacy, with radiators that clicked through cold nights and a refrigerator covered in grocery coupons. Grace had lived there since leaving college 4 years earlier, when Linda needed surgery and months of recovery. What was supposed to be one semester away from school became another, then another. By the time her mother returned to work part-time, tuition had increased and Grace had learned that rent did not care about unfinished plans. She worked 5 shifts a week at Harrison Street Grill, picked up extra weekends when she could, and kept a community college brochure inside the drawer beside her bed. "Are you going to tell me why a billionaire gave you his card?" Linda asked. Grace opened the refrigerator. "His daughter had a difficult evening. I helped her find somewhere quiet. And he thinks that makes me qualified to solve his life." "Are you?" "Absolutely not." The next morning, Grace woke to a voicemail from Nathan. He had not sent an assistant. She gave him credit for that much. His message was brief. Sophie had asked whether Grace worked Saturday. Grace listened twice before calling the restaurant and confirming her afternoon shift. At 3:15, Nathan and Sophie entered Harrison Street Grill without business guests, assistants, or the polished formality of the previous night. Sophie wore jeans, sneakers, and a purple sweatshirt. She stayed close to her father but looked directly at Grace. "Hi," Grace said. "Hi," Sophie answered. Nathan seemed to understand that reacting too enthusiastically would ruin the moment. They took a booth near the back where the lunch crowd had thinned. Grace brought menus, and Sophie chose grilled cheese again. Nathan ordered coffee. Nothing remarkable happened, which Grace suspected was exactly why the visit worked. Sophie colored on the children's menu. Nathan kept his phone in his pocket. Grace checked their table like any other customers. Before leaving, Sophie carefully folded her drawing and handed it to Grace. It showed 3 uneven flowers beneath an enormous yellow sun. "Thank you," Grace said. Sophie nodded and walked toward the door. Nathan remained behind for a moment. "She asked about you this morning. I figured. I want to make you an offer." Grace closed her eyes briefly. "Mr. Cole, please hear me out." He named a salary nearly twice what Grace expected to earn in a year at the restaurant, plus health insurance and flexible hours. For several seconds, she genuinely could not speak. That money could clear Linda's remaining medical bills. It could pay tuition. It could create the kind of breathing room Grace had not experienced in years. Nathan mistook her silence for consideration. "You would not be replacing her therapist," he said. "I would like you to spend time with Sophie after school and help establish some consistency." Grace looked through the front window. Sophie was waiting outside with Nathan's driver, studying the drawing Grace had taped beside the register. How many caregivers has she had since her mother died? Nathan hesitated. 4. Why did they leave? Different reasons. One moved. One returned to school. Sophie refused to cooperate with another. The most recent position was temporary. Grace nodded slowly. "And now you want number 5. I want someone she trusts. She met me yesterday. That is more trust than she has shown most people in months." Grace understood his desperation now, which made refusing harder rather than easier. "I cannot take the job." Nathan stared at her. "Is the salary too low?" Grace almost laughed. "That question explains why you do not understand my answer." "Then help me understand." "Sophie does not need me installed in her house because one dinner went well. She needs people who will still be there when things do not go well. I would never ask you to leave because she had a difficult day. That is not what I mean." Grace lowered her voice. "I have a life too. I want to go back to school. I want to finish what I started. If I accept because the money is impossible to refuse, Sophie becomes responsible for keeping my life financially comfortable. That is not fair to her." Nathan's expression softened. "You turned down that salary because you might eventually leave?" "I turned it down because your daughter should not have to wonder which adult disappears next." Nathan looked towards Sophie through the window. Grace picked up the drawing and straightened the tape, holding it to the register. "If she wants grilled cheese here sometimes, bring her. If she wants to say hello, I will say hello. But do not hire every person who manages to reach her." Nathan was quiet before asking, "What should I do instead?" Grace met his eyes. "Be the person who stays." Over the next 3 weeks, Saturday afternoon became the one predictable appointment Nathan never placed on his calendar. Sophie simply expected grilled cheese at Harrison Street Grill, and Nathan learned that disappointing her over something so small carried more weight than moving a business meeting ever had. Grace never treated their visits as special. She brought menus, refilled Nathan's coffee, asked Sophie whether she wanted the usual booth or the quieter table near the window, then returned to work. The choice mattered. Some Saturdays Sophie wanted the booth. Other days she chose the window. Once she asked to sit near the kitchen because she liked hearing plates being stacked. Nathan started noticing details he had previously dismissed as preferences that adults could override. "You always give her 2 choices," he said one afternoon when Grace brought apple slices instead of fries because Sophie had selected them. "Because 10 choices can feel like another problem. I usually ask her what she wants to do for the entire weekend." Grace smiled. "How does that go?" Nathan glanced at Sophie, who was drawing a dog wearing a crown. "Usually she says nothing. Try smaller questions." Nathan considered this. "Like what? Blue sweater or green sweater? Breakfast at home or somewhere else? Read now or after dinner?" Things she can actually answer without planning her whole life. Nathan looked mildly offended. "I plan entire Developments with fewer instructions than you have given me. Buildings do not have feelings. Sophie looked up from her drawing. Some buildings are ugly. Grace covered a laugh with her hand. Nathan stared at his daughter before smiling. That sounded suspiciously like your grandfather. Sophie returned to coloring, but a tiny grin remained on her face. Grace noticed Nathan watching it as though he had been handed something priceless. The changes were not immediate. The following Saturday, Sophie arrived upset because Nathan had promised to pick her up from school Friday and sent his assistant instead when a meeting ran late. She barely spoke during lunch. Nathan tried questions until Grace quietly placed his coffee down and said, "You are doing the thing." "What thing?" "Too many questions." He stopped. 5 minutes passed before Sophie finally said, "You said you would come." Nathan's instinct was visible on his face. Grace could almost hear the explanation forming. The meeting had run long. A client had flown in. The assistant was trusted. Sophie had been safe. Instead, he put his phone face down. "I did say that." Sophie stared at the table. "And you did not." "No. I am sorry." No excuse followed. Sophie did not suddenly brighten. She did not forgive him with a dramatic hug. She simply nodded and ate half her sandwich. Grace considered that progress. When her shift ended, Nathan was waiting near the front while Sophie read a library book in the booth. "Apparently apologizing does not immediately solve everything," he said. Grace tied her coat belt. "That must be difficult for a man whose company puts completion dates on buildings. You enjoy this too much." "A little." He laughed, and Grace saw something different in him. At their first meeting, Nathan had seemed polished enough to belong behind glass. Now his tie was loose, his coffee had gone cold, and there was a purple sticker on his sleeve that Sophie had placed there without telling him. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Depends. You said you wanted to return to school. What would you study?" Grace hesitated. The question felt different from his earlier offer because there was no checkbook. Hiding behind it. Early childhood education. Maybe family support work eventually. Why? Because adults spend a lot of time describing children without listening to them. Nathan looked toward Sophie. "You really believe listening changes that much?" "Listening does not fix everything. Sometimes it just tells someone they are not alone while things are hard." His expression became thoughtful. "I was not home much before my wife died," he said. "I kept thinking there would be time later. Then after she died, I tried to compensate by arranging everything Sophie could possibly need." Grace heard the guilt beneath the explanation. "You cannot redo those years." "I know, but you can be here Saturday." Nathan glanced around the ordinary restaurant. "I used to think being here meant being available if something went wrong. Maybe being here means being here before anything goes wrong." Sophie suddenly called from the booth. "Dad, can we go to the bookstore after this?" Nathan automatically reached toward his phone, then stopped before touching it. "Sure." Sophie narrowed her eyes. "Do you have work?" Nathan looked at Grace for half a second. "Not this afternoon." Sophie smiled. It was quick and uncomplicated. Nathan picked up her coat and helped her gather the drawings scattered across the table. Before leaving, he turned back toward Grace. "Thank you." "For what?" "Not doing this for me." Grace watched him follow his daughter through the door. For the first time, Nathan was not trying to find someone who could reach Sophie for him. He was learning how to walk beside her himself. By Thursday afternoon, Nathan had rearranged 3 meetings so he could leave the office before 4. His assistant had asked twice whether something urgent had happened. Nathan had simply said he had somewhere important to be. Sophie's school presentation began at 5:30, and for the first time in months, his calendar showed nothing after 4:30 except her name. At Harrison Street Grill, Grace was halfway through her shift when Sophie arrived with Nathan for an early dinner. The girl carried a cardboard model of the Chicago skyline she had built for class, complete with uneven paper windows and a blue river drawn across the base. "That looks impressive," Grace said. Sophie carefully placed it on the empty side of the booth. "I have to talk about it tonight." "Are you nervous?" Sophie considered the question. "A little." Nathan sat across from her. "You will do great." Sophie looked at him. "You are coming?" "Absolutely." The certainty in his answer made Grace glance over. Sophie smiled and returned to her grilled cheese. 20 minutes later, Nathan's phone began vibrating against the table. He ignored the first call. Then came another. On the third, he looked at the screen. "I need to take this." He stepped toward the front windows while Grace cleared nearby tables. His conversation lasted several minutes. When he returned, His expression had changed. "There is a problem with the River North project," he explained. "I may need to stop at the office." Sophie's smile disappeared. "For how long?" "Probably an hour. My presentation starts at 5:30. "I know. I can have Melissa take you to school, and I will meet you there." Sophie lowered her eyes. Grace continued stacking plates because this was not her conversation. Nathan checked the time. "I will do everything I can." Sophie quietly closed the cardboard model and pushed away the rest of her sandwich. Nathan noticed Grace looking at him. "What?" he asked. "Nothing. That expression is not nothing." Grace carried the plates toward the service station. Nathan followed. "Say it." She stopped beside the counter. "Your company will notice you were gone for an hour. Your daughter will remember whether you came." Nathan stared at her. "This project employs hundreds of people. Then I assume you hired capable people." "It is not that simple." "I did not say it was." Grace kept her voice low. "Being a parent probably is not convenient very often." Nathan looked back at Sophie. The girl was carefully pressing one loose paper building onto her model. "What if the problem gets worse?" he asked. "I cannot answer that for you." Grace picked up another tray. "You wanted to know how to reach her. Maybe sometimes reaching her means showing up where you promised to be." Nathan stood silently for several seconds. Then he returned to the booth, sat down, and called his office. "Melissa, move the 6 o'clock call to tomorrow morning. Have Daniel handle River North. Tell him I trust his judgment." He listened. "No, I will not be available until 8. Sophie looked up. Nathan ended the call and placed his phone inside his jacket. "We should leave in 15 minutes if we want good seats." Sophie stared at him as if she was waiting for the sentence to change. "You are really coming?" "I said I would." At the school auditorium, Nathan sat in the third row among parents carrying coats, coffee cups, and restless younger siblings. There was no reserved seating, and nobody seemed particularly impressed by his last name. Grace was not there. There was nobody to tell him when to put away his phone or what expression to use. When Sophie's turn came, she walked to the front holding her cardboard skyline with both hands. Her voice was barely audible during the first sentence. Nathan leaned forward but did not interrupt. Sophie tried again. By the third sentence, she was speaking clearly enough for the room to hear. She explained why she had included the river, which buildings she liked, and why cities needed parks where people could sit without buying anything. Nathan smiled at that. When she finished, he applauded with everyone else. Sophie immediately searched the audience. The moment she found him, her shoulders relaxed. Later, outside the school, she slipped her hand into his. "Did you like my buildings?" "I love them. Even the crooked one. Especially the crooked one." His phone remained inside his pocket. The River North problem was still waiting. His company still needed him. Nothing about his responsibilities had disappeared simply because he had chosen his daughter for one evening. Yet as they walked toward the car, Nathan finally understood something Grace had been trying to show him from the beginning. Sophie did not need a father who could remove every difficulty from her life. She needed one whose promises meant he would still be sitting in the third row when she looked for him. The morning after Sophie's presentation, Nathan arrived at his office before 7 and discovered that the River North problem had been resolved without him. Daniel had made 2 calls, approved a revised schedule, and sent Nathan a concise report before midnight. Nothing had collapsed because Nathan had spent one evening in a school auditorium. The realization was uncomfortable because it exposed how often he had confused responsibility with indispensability. Over the next month, he began making changes that would once have seemed impossible. He protected 2 evenings each week from meetings. He picked Sophie up from school himself whenever his schedule allowed, and when he promised to be somewhere, he treated that promise like a business commitment. He also found a licensed child counselor who specialized in grief and family transitions. This time, Nathan did not present counseling to Sophie as something intended to fix her. He explained that losing her mother had been hard for both of them, and that talking with someone might help when feelings became too heavy to carry alone. Sophie agreed to try. Some weeks were better than others. She still became overwhelmed in crowded places. She still had mornings when getting ready for school took twice as long as expected. But Nathan stopped measuring progress by how convenient Sophie became for the adults around her. One Saturday, nearly 6 weeks after the school presentation, they returned to Harrison Street Grill. Sophie chose the window table and immediately opened a book. Grace brought Nathan coffee and Sophie apple juice. "How was your week?" Grace asked. "Dad burned pancakes," Sophie said without looking up. Nathan sighed. We agreed never to discuss that outside the house. Grace smiled. How badly? The smoke detector had an opinion. Traitor, Nathan said to his daughter. Sophie laughed, and the sound made him smile before he could stop himself. Grace noticed that he no longer watched Sophie constantly, as if waiting for trouble. He simply sat with her. We found a new counselor, Nathan said quietly when Sophie became absorbed in her book. Sophie chose between two people after meeting both. You gave her a choice. I occasionally follow instructions. Remarkable. Nathan smiled. How is school? Grace paused. What school? The one you said you wanted to return to. Grace looked toward another table. I have not enrolled. Why not? Tuition. Work hours. My mother is doing better, but bills still exist. Nathan immediately said, I could help. Grace gave him one look. Right. Forget I said that. You are learning. Slowly. Nathan took a drink of coffee. Are there evening classes? Yes. Then why not start with one? Grace had asked herself the same question for years, but always with a reason waiting behind it. One class seemed too small to matter. One semester would not finish a degree. There was always another expense. Maybe, she said. That is suspiciously close to an excuse. Grace stared at him. Did the billionaire who tried to hire me after knowing me for one day just lecture me about life decisions? I believe this is what people call personal growth. She laughed despite herself. The following Monday, Grace sat at her kitchen table with Linda and opened the community college website. She registered for one evening course in child development. The tuition would tighten her budget, and she would need to trade one shift each week. But when the confirmation appeared on the screen, Grace felt as though a door she had been staring at for years had finally opened an inch. She texted Nathan before she could reconsider. I enrolled in one class. His response came several minutes later. Good. No offer to pay. No grand congratulations. Then another message appeared. Sophie says one class counts. Grace smiled. That Saturday, Sophie brought her a new drawing. It showed 3 people standing outside a restaurant beneath a crooked yellow sun. Grace taped it beside the first picture. Nathan watched from the booth. Something between them had changed, though neither of them named it. He no longer came because he expected Grace to solve Sophie. Grace no longer saw only the wealthy man who believed every difficulty could be delegated. They were becoming witnesses to each other's effort. Nathan was learning to build a life around presence instead of control. Grace was beginning to reclaim a future she had, postponed for everyone else. Neither transformation belonged to the other, and perhaps that was why the connection forming between them felt increasingly real. By the middle of the semester, Grace had learned how much life could fit into a single week. She worked 4 restaurant shifts, attended class every Tuesday evening, studied after midnight when necessary, and still shared breakfast with Linda on Sunday mornings. She was tired, but it was a different kind of tired from the exhaustion she had carried for years. This time, the effort was moving her towards something she had chosen. Nathan and Sophie continued visiting Harrison Street Grill most Saturdays. Sophie talked more now, although Grace had learned not to measure her progress by conversation. Some afternoons the girl filled 3 pages with drawings. Other days, she simply ate beside her father while reading. Nathan had stopped trying to turn every quiet moment into a problem. One Saturday in October, he arrived without Sophie. She is at a friend's birthday party, he explained. Grace paused while setting down his coffee. She went. She asked me to stay for the first 30 minutes. Then she told me I was embarrassing her. That sounds promising. I have never been so pleased to be dismissed. Grace laughed. Nathan looked at her for a moment longer than usual, and something unspoken passed between them. Before either could acknowledge it, Grace's manager approached holding his phone. Grace, you need to see this. A photograph filled the screen. It had been taken outside the restaurant the previous weekend. Grace was standing beside Nathan, while Sophie held both their hands crossing the sidewalk. The headline described Grace as the waitress who had somehow tamed a billionaire's troubled daughter. Grace read it twice. Her stomach tightened. Tamed, she said. Nathan stood immediately. Let me handle this. Grace turned toward him. No, my communications team can contact the site. That is exactly what I do not want. They are using Sophie. And me. Nathan stopped. Grace handed the phone back to her manager. By evening, 2 more websites had repeated the story. One called Grace Nathan's Mystery Woman. Another suggested he had hired her privately. A reporter called the restaurant asking whether Grace had received gifts from the Cole family. The next morning, someone contacted Linda through social media. That was enough. Grace called Nathan. "We need to talk." They met at a coffee shop several blocks from the restaurant. Nathan arrived alone and sat across from her. "I can have security deal with anyone bothering your mother. My mother does not need your security." "Grace, I am trying to protect you." "I know. But every solution you have starts with your money or your staff." Nathan leaned back. The criticism landed because it was true. "What do you want me to do?" "Nothing. That does not feel responsible. It is not your responsibility to fix my life." Grace folded her hands around her coffee cup. "Do you understand what those stories are saying? They turned Sophie into some impossible child who needed to be controlled. They turned me into a waitress who performed a miracle. And now they are waiting for you to reward me. I know that is not what happened. Then you know why I cannot let that become our story." Nathan was quiet. Grace continued, more softly, "I care about Sophie, and I care about you more than I planned to." His expression shifted. It was the first time either of them had admitted what had been growing between them. "I care about you too." Grace looked down. Hearing it made the next words harder. "Then I need some distance." Nathan did not argue. "From Sophie? Not forever. But she has a counselor. She has you. She is friends again. I cannot become the person everyone credits for her getting better. And from me." Grace met his eyes. "Yes." Nathan absorbed that without reaching for his phone or offering another solution. "How much distance?" "I do not know." He nodded slowly. "All right." Grace had expected persuasion. Somehow his acceptance hurt more. Nathan stood, then paused beside the table. "For what it is worth, Sophie changed because she did difficult work herself. I changed because I needed to. You showed us something we were missing, but you never owed either of us rescue." Grace felt her eyes sting, though she smiled. "You really have been listening. I had a good teacher." After he left, Grace remained beside the window until her coffee cooled. The following Saturday, the familiar booth at Harrison Street Grill stayed empty. Grace noticed it every time she crossed the dining room, but she did not regret her choice. That evening she went home, opened her textbook, and studied for Monday's exam. Across the city, Nathan made pancakes with Sophie and burned only one. Neither Grace nor Nathan knew whether the space between them would eventually become permanent. For the first time, however, neither tried to force an answer before life was ready to give them one. 6 months passed before Grace saw Nathan and Sophie again. The distance had not erased them from her life, but it had returned her attention to the future she had nearly abandoned years earlier. She completed her child development course with an A, enrolled in 2 more classes, and reduced another restaurant shift after earning a paid internship at an after-school program on the north side. The money was modest, and some evenings she still carried dinner plates until 10, but for the first time Grace could see a path connecting the woman she was to the work she wanted to do. Nathan respected the boundary she had requested. He never sent flowers to the restaurant, never appeared outside her classes, and never offered to pay a bill. Once, Sophie mailed a handmade holiday card to Harrison Street Grill. Grace kept it beside the drawings in her apartment. She heard nothing else until a Saturday afternoon in April, when her internship program held a community fundraiser in a neighborhood recreation center. Grace was helping children arrange donated books when a familiar voice behind her said, "Do you still like crooked buildings?" Grace turned. Sophie stood several feet away wearing jeans, bright sneakers, and a yellow jacket. She seemed taller. Nathan stood behind her in a charcoal sweater and dark pants, holding 2 paper cups of lemonade. He did not move toward Grace. He waited. Sophie did not. She crossed the space and wrapped her arms around Grace. Grace hugged her gently. "You got taller. Dad says that is what happens when people feed me. Your father has become very knowledgeable. He still burns pancakes." Nathan sighed. 6 months apart, and this is immediately where we are. Grace laughed, and the old ease returned so naturally that it surprised her. They spent the next hour at the fundraiser without becoming the center of each other's attention. Sophie joined an art activity. Nathan helped move folding chairs when a volunteer asked. Grace continued working with the children assigned to her table. She noticed that Nathan checked his phone once, typed a short response, then put it away. More importantly, she noticed he did not watch Sophie every second. He trusted her to move through the room without treating independence as danger. Near the end of the event, Sophie showed Grace a paper bookmark she had made for her. I still see my counselor, she said matter-of-factly. I like her now. I am glad. Dad sees somebody too. Nathan nearly dropped his lemonade. Sophie, what? You said therapy is normal. Grace pressed her lips together to keep from laughing. She has you there. Constantly. Sophie ran back toward the craft table before he could defend himself. Nathan looked at Grace. She is doing well. I can see that. Not perfectly. Nobody asked for perfectly. He nodded. I finally understand that. Grace studied him. He seemed lighter, not because his responsibilities had disappeared, but because he no longer carried them as proof that nobody else could be trusted. How about you? He asked. 2 classes this semester. Internship 3 afternoons a week. Still at the restaurant on weekends. That sounds exhausting. It is. I love it. Then I am happy for you. There was no offer hidden behind the words. No question about tuition. Grace appreciated that more than she expected. When the fundraiser ended, Sophie left with another family for a scheduled sleepover. Nathan watched her climb into their minivan and wave through the window. She has a sleepover? Grace asked. Her third. And you are surviving? I have been instructed not to text the other parents unless there is an emergency. Who instructed you? Sophie. Her counselor. My assistant. Apparently, there was a coalition. Grace smiled. They stood beneath the recreation center awning as a light spring rain began falling. Nathan slipped his hands into his pockets. Grace, I would like to ask you something, and I want you to know that no is an acceptable answer. That introduction sounds dangerous. Would you have dinner with me? She looked at him. Dinner. A real one. No Sophie. No restaurant shift. No employment proposal. No problem I secretly expect you to solve. You have prepared rules. I had 6 months. Grace felt something warm settle beneath her ribs. Why now? Nathan considered the question. Because before, part of what connected us was that I needed help. Then I started caring about you, and I could not tell where gratitude ended and something else began. You gave me enough distance to find out. And I miss you when nothing is wrong. The simplicity of it reached her more deeply than any grand declaration could have. Grace looked through the glass doors at the children cleaning up paper scraps and volunteers stacking chairs. 6 months earlier, she had been afraid of becoming a supporting character in Nathan's life. Now she had classes, work she cared about, plans that belonged entirely to her, and a man standing beside her who had finally learned not to offer rescue. Friday, she said. Nathan blinked. Friday. I finish at the restaurant at 7. His smile appeared slowly. I can do Friday. And somewhere normal. Define normal. Somewhere dinner does not require a reservation made by your assistant. That eliminates several places. You will survive. Nathan laughed. When the rain softened, they walked toward the sidewalk together. Neither reached for the other's hand. Not yet. There was no need to rush the moment. For once, Nathan was not trying to control what happened next, and Grace was not afraid that accepting something good meant surrendering the life she was building. Friday was only dinner, and that was exactly why both of them were looking forward to it. 1 year after their first real date, Grace woke on a Sunday morning to the smell of something burning. She walked into Nathan's kitchen, wearing an old college sweatshirt, and found him standing over the stove with a spatula in one hand while Sophie sat at the counter, trying not to laugh. I followed the recipe, Nathan said before Grace could speak. You say that every time. Sophie pointed toward a plate containing one unusually dark pancake. That one is Dad's. Nathan looked offended. I was planning to eat it. Good, Grace said. Accountability matters. Sophie laughed, and Nathan gave Grace the look he reserved for moments when he knew she had joined the opposition. Their life had changed gradually rather than dramatically. Grace had completed another year of classes and now worked 4 afternoons each week at the after-school program while keeping 2 weekend shifts at Harrison Street Grill. She was still paying tuition herself, still sharing expenses with Linda when necessary, and still planning carefully around textbooks, rent, and work. Nathan had never offered to erase those responsibilities again. When Grace needed help, he asked what kind instead of deciding for her. Their relationship had grown through dinners, walks, grocery trips, school events, and evenings when both were too tired to do anything except sit together with coffee. Sophie remained in counseling and continued making progress at her own pace. She had friends now, attended sleepovers, and still sometimes needed quiet when a room became overwhelming. Nathan no longer treated those moments as failures. He simply asked what she needed, and and stayed nearby. Grace had never tried to become Sophie's replacement mother. She was Grace, and that was enough. Sometimes Sophie asked her for homework help. Sometimes she wanted her father instead. Nobody kept score. After breakfast, Sophie disappeared upstairs to find her sneakers because they had promised to visit the park. Nathan started loading the dishwasher while Grace wiped the counter. "You have class tomorrow?" he asked. "At 6. And work before that. Until 4. Dinner afterward? If you are volunteering to cook, I may reconsider this relationship." Nathan stepped closer. "I know a good restaurant." "You know 50 good restaurants." "I know one where the waitress used to criticize me for checking my phone." Grace smiled. "She sounds exhausting. I fell in love with her anyway." The words were no longer surprising, but they still warmed her. Grace rested her hands against his chest. "Good choice." Eventually, Nathan kissed her forehead and held her for a moment. Nothing about their relationship had removed the differences between their lives. Nathan still ran a company with thousands of employees. Grace still compared grocery prices and worried about tuition deadlines. They disagreed about schedules, money, parenting boundaries, and whether Nathan truly needed 6 dress shirts that looked identical. What made their relationship work was not pretending those differences did not exist. It was learning to discuss them without turning love into obligation. Sophie came downstairs carrying one sneaker. "I cannot find the other one." Nathan reached automatically for his phone. "I have a call at 11, so maybe we should leave soon." Sophie's face changed slightly. Grace noticed, but she said nothing. Nathan noticed too. He looked at the calendar notification glowing on the screen. A year earlier, he might have reorganized the entire morning around it. Instead, he typed a short message. "I am moving the call." Sophie looked at him. "Because of the park?" "Because I said we were going." "It is okay if you have work." Nathan put the phone face down. "Work will still be there this afternoon." Sophie smiled and ran upstairs to continue searching. Grace watched him. "That was very responsible. I had a good teacher." "You cannot keep using that line forever." "I intend to." 10 minutes later, they found the missing sneaker beneath the couch. Nathan locked the front door while Sophie hurried down the sidewalk. Grace waited beside him. He reached for her hand, and she intertwined her fingers with his. There had been no miracle after all. Grace had not transformed Sophie with some extraordinary gift, and Nathan had not rescued Grace from an ordinary life. Sophie had learned to trust again with time, support, and a father who finally understood that presence could not be delegated. Grace had returned to the future she once postponed. Nathan had discovered that love was less about providing everything than consistently showing up. Sophie called for them from halfway down the block. Nathan and Grace laughed and followed together, hand in hand, toward a Sunday that held nothing remarkable except the people they had chosen to spend it with.